Understanding Business Cycles and Trends. Welcome to our sixth topic in this course, in which we will delve into two concepts that are at the heart of how the economy develops: business cycles and trends. Please read Chapter 6 in the textbook. In this topic, you will learn about the patterns of economic growth through cycles and trends, and 1. Why understanding business cycles is important. 2. The competing views of the business cycle, Jevons versus Mitchell. 3. How a business cycle is determined. 4. Techniques to analyze the business cycle. 5. The difference between classical and growth cycles. 6. The various theoretical causes of the business cycle. 7. How risk and instability play a role in cycles. 8. Why economists worry about incomplete recovery from recession, known as weakness persistence or hysteresis. 9. Empirical findings that explain aspects of the cycle. Let's begin. Our starting point is to ask, why does macroeconomics focus on business cycles and trends in the economy? Macroeconomics is the study of economic dynamics, which are characterized by cycles and trends. So, it should not be surprising that we need to focus attention specifically on both dynamics of the economy. We will begin with a discussion of the business cycle and various ways to view it, followed by a discussion of economic trends. What is the business cycle? The late business cycle scholar Victor Zarnowitz aptly described it as an empirical phenomenon founded upon historical experience. This highlights the concept as empirical and historical at the same time. Business cycles are fluctuation sequences in the aggregate economic activity of a nation. Over time, there have been two fundamental definitions of the business cycle. One was put forth by economist William Stanley Jevons in the 1800s, which defined the cycle as a series of commercial crises in business activity. However, by the early 1900s, Jevons' definition and perspective gave way to Wesley Mitchell's and the National Bureau of Economic Research (NBER) approach, which Mitchell directed, in which the business cycle was defined as a statistical, cyclical pattern of business activity, determined by the internal dynamic of change in the economy. The NBER concept continues today as the primary perspective on the business cycle. Nonetheless, every so often researchers seem to revert to the Jevons crisis-driven cycle idea. Indeed, I would argue that the 2020 recession might be considered more of a crisis-driven cycle than the NBER-type cycle. How are statistical cycles or endogenous cycles defined? Wesley Mitchell, who teamed up with Arthur Burns, who later would become a chair of Eisenhower's Council of Economic Advisers and even later would become a chair of the Federal Reserve Board, published Measuring Business Cycles in 1946. That Mitchell and Burns book would become what my mentor, Dr. Jeffrey Moore, who was a colleague and protege of Arthur Burns at the NBER, described as the Business Cycle Bible. In the opening of the book, a working definition of a business cycle was posited. The researchers wrote, "Business cycles are a type of fluctuation found in the aggregate economic activity of nations that organize their work mainly in business enterprises. A cycle consists of expansions occurring at about the same time in many economic activities, followed by similarly general recessions, contractions, and revivals, which merge into the expansion phase of the next cycle. This sequence of changes is recurrent, but not periodic. In duration, business cycles vary from more than 1 year to 10 or 12 years. They are not divisible into shorter cycles of similar character, with amplitudes approximating their own." In that definition, Burns and Mitchell laid out the phases of the business cycle, which are shown on this stylized business cycle graphic. The expansion phase begins at the point when the economy returns to its previous peak, and then expands beyond that point, marking prosperity. A recession or contraction follows a peak in economic activity, and recedes to its trough or low point. Then a revival or recovery is from that trough to the return to the previous peak. All of these are shown on the slide, and are known as the classical business cycle. We shall see why it is dubbed classical shortly, since there is another companion NBER definition of a cycle that was developed in the 1960s. For the United States, the National Bureau of Economic Research remains the arbiter of the business cycle turning point dates, which is a research role that the group embraced since the 1920s. But you might ask, why do economists need to understand the cyclical turning points in the business cycle? In a nutshell, we need to understand cyclical turning points in the economy to understand one of the dynamics of the economy. John Maynard Keynes opined that, quote, by a cyclical movement we mean that as the system progresses in, for example, the upward direction, the forces propelling it upwards at first gather force and have a cumulative effect on one another, but gradually lose their strength, until at a certain point they tend to be replaced by forces operating in the opposite direction, which in turn gather force for a time and accentuate one another, until they too, having reached their maximum development, wane and give place to their opposite. Unquote. Economic theory must explain why this phenomenon of the crisis occurs. Okay, you may say that you understand Keynes' point, that we need to understand how the cyclical process works in the economy. But why do we care that there is a reference business cycle chronology of peaks and troughs in the cycle? The answer is simply that the acceptance of the classical cycle turning point dates, whether it is from the NBER for the United States or other official organizations for other countries, provides researchers with a common benchmark for analyzing the state of the economy. What are turning point dates in the U.S. business cycle? Back to that definition of the business cycle by Burns and Mitchell. Turning point dates are the high, peak, and low, trough, points in business activity. The National Bureau's classical business cycle chronology for the United States extends from 1873 to the present, as shown in this table. Some of the key takeaways are: 1. The last recession began in February 2020 and followed the longest expansion on record. 2. The longest contraction on record was not the Great Depression, but the recession of 1873 to 1879, which was 65 months. 3. Post-World War II contractions were shorter, on average, than earlier episodes. 4. Post-World War II recessions have lasted 11.1 months on average, but the expansions have lasted 64.2 months, on average. That means expansion durations have been 6 times as long as the average recession in that post-war period. 5. The 2020 recession is an outlier in recession duration, with only a 2-month span. Although the NBER officially accepted that as a classical business cycle, consistent with its past cyclical experience, the 2020 recession is more of a Jevons-type crisis cycle than a Burns and Mitchell concept of a business cycle. Is a 2-quarter consecutive decline in real GDP rule the way a recession is determined? No. A 2-quarter decline in real GDP is part of broader set of rules of thumb for spotting recession that business cycle scholar and former BLS Commissioner Julius Shiskin offered to the public in his New York Times article in 1974. Even then it was not a new idea, but Shiskin sketched out some simple rules of thumb. He wrote: 1. Real GDP should decline for 2 successive quarters, and industrial production should decline for a 6-month period. 2. Real GDP should decline by at least 1.5%. Payroll employment also should decline by at least 1.5%. And the unemployment rate should increase by 2 percentage points. And, 3, for 6 months or longer, the employment diffusion should be less than 25%. That is, no more than 25% of industries are expanding its workforce. With that said, a 2-quarter decline in output often is popularly used to mark a recession. Witness, for example, a May 9, 2024, Financial Times story, entitled, UK Exits Recession with 0.6% First Quarter Growth. The story opined that the UK economy exited its second half 2023 technical recession with the first quarter's increase in real GDP. The phrase, technical recession, is a shorthand way to assessing the recession. The UK Office for National Statistics offered this explanation in a November 2022 report. There has been a long-standing international convention that a technical recession comprises 2 or more consecutive quarters of contracting output. This originated from American presidential speechwriters in the 1960s, where it was proposed that one period of falling output does not constitute a recession, but that 2 consecutive quarters do. This likely reflected the volatile movements in volume GDP, which were more common at that time, and so did not provide a useful indication of the economic cycle. The Office of National Statistics report went on to note, turning points are typically communicated in the context of the economic cycle, in which the economy alternates between the recession and expansion phases. This is based on a judgment of being able to identify peaks and troughs in GDP, where recession phases are periods between a peak and a trough, and expansion phases are periods between a trough and peak. These will be associated with the headline change in GDP, though identifying peaks and troughs is more nuanced. So, the use of the phrase, technical recession, might serve as a real-time alternative to waiting for some advisory board to determine the turning point dates in the economic cycle, which requires more data, more time, and more deliberation to assess the breadth, depth, and length of these recession episodes. With that said, however, it is only a shorthand rule of thumb. At this point, you should be able to answer the next question. Can the turning point dates in a nation's economic activity be measured by the cyclical turning points in real GDP? Similar to the prior question, the answer is no. The sole use of real GDP to mark off the business cycle is a shorthand method that some researchers use, but it is incomplete. How does the NBER determine a recession in the business cycle? The measurement of turning points in the classical business cycle have been based on the so-called 3 Ds: depth, duration, and diffusion. These criteria are: 1. How deep is the decline cumulatively? 2. How long did the contraction last? 3. How widespread was the contraction? I am sure that the terms depth and duration are intuitive, but what is meant by diffusion? How is diffusion measured? The concept of diffusion is measured by an index that shows the percentage of components of an economic aggregate, such as employment or industrial production, that are expanding. With the monthly employment report, the BLS calculates the percentage of industries increasing jobs, and the Federal Reserve Board includes a similar type of measure as part of its industrial production report. These diffusion indexes can be measured over different spans, such as 1 month, 3 months, or 6-month spans. The longer the span, the smoother the pattern. Are there other conceptual ways to measure economic cycles? Yes. The The National Bureau of Economic Research, which is the arbiter of turning points in the classical U.S. business cycle, also has produced considerable research on what is termed the growth cycle, or deviation cycle. What is a growth cycle? This idea of the growth cycle came about based on research by NBER economist Ilse Mintz, who explored mild economic cycles that occur around trend growth. She found that these mild swings were regularly associated with corresponding cycles in sensitive leading indicators of the economy and diffusion indexes. Although we will not delve too deeply into this topic, it is important for several reasons. First, and foremost, is that growth cycles typically turn up or down before the classical business cycle. Moreover, growth cycles are recurrent fluctuations in the economy, but measured as deviations from trend, which is also the same concept of the output gap. The graphic on this slide shows the concept. Note that if the growth rate in the economy turns negative, that is a classical business cycle recession, which we previously discussed. Also note that non-negative growth rates above trend growth represent a high growth phase in the economy, while non-negative growth rates below its trend growth represent a low growth phase of the growth cycle. What is meant by the term soft landing? The common usage of the term soft landing has been to describe a policy-induced or an internally driven moderation in economic growth without a contraction in the economy. Although this terminology is colloquial usage, a formal economic counterpart concept is the NBER growth recession, which is the low growth phase of the growth cycle. So, a policy-induced soft landing in the economy may be thought of as economic growth being brought down from a high growth phase of the growth cycle to the low growth rate phase. What are the stylized facts about classical business cycles? Which theories try to explain? Based on the 3D classification, this helps to define those stylized facts of the U.S. classical business cycle. Those facts are: 1. Business cycle duration. Recessions last about 11 months, expansions about 64 months. 2. Business cycle depth, or amplitude. Real GDP tends to contract by 2 to 3%, on average, during recessions. 3. On average, non-farm unit labor costs rise by 4.7% during post-war U.S. recessions, with a greater increase of 8.0% for recessions that are supply-induced, versus only a 2.2% increase for demand-shocked recessions. 4. Diffusion, or the breadth of change. On average, about 20% of industries cut back on employment, with a higher percentage for supply-led recessions. What is the importance of classifying economic indicators by their cyclical tendencies for leading, being coincident with, and lagging the turning points in the business cycle? This classification scheme helped early business cycle researchers understand the sequences of economic activity. So, new orders typically are leading indicators, but inventories are typically lagging indicators of the business cycle swings. Intuitively, businesses would experience a decline in new orders before production turns down, and, in turn, inventories would tend to rise after demand slows. But there are lots of simple relationships, such as these, that tell us something about how the economy operates. The early research at the National Bureau of Economic Research was a search for those cyclical indicators that showed consistent timing relationships with the business cycle, whether they were leading, lagging, or coincident with turning points in the overall business cycle. This was a way to understand the sequences in the business cycle. What is a composite cyclical indicator? If economic indicators are classified as leading, lagging, or coincident with the turning points in the overall business cycle, then similar indicators by timing can be combined. Therefore, a composite cyclical index is a summary measure of economic indicators that share common timing classification relative to the reference business cycle, and is compiled using statistical indicators over a broad range of economic activities for diversification. The most consistent set of leading indicators, coincident indicators, and lagging indicators get compiled into a single summary measure, adjusting separately for each indicator's volatility, so that no single measure dominates the change in the overall composite, simply due to a single component's volatility. The U.S. Commerce Department used to produce composite business cycle indicators, but that program was transferred to the private industry group, the Conference Board, which continues to compile those indicators for the United States, and has expanded its program internationally as well. The OECD also compiles leading economic indicators for the OECD countries, which includes the United States. The Conference Board's leading and coincident composite indexes are shown on the left-hand side of this slide, while the components of those two indicators and the lagging composite indicator are shown on the right-hand side of this slide. A colleague of mine at a financial institution, when we worked together, would describe the composite index of leading indicators, when it was being compiled by the U.S. Department of Commerce, as old wine in a new bottle. His thinking was that if you were tracking each of the components of the leading indicator, as they were being reported, then by the time you got the leading economic indicator report, it was nothing new. On the other hand, the composite index methodology, for compiling indexes, will standardize the fluctuations of each component, so that a more volatile component would not dominate a component with a narrow range of fluctuation. By doing that standardization, and even weighting individual components, if appropriate, because some were more reliable than others, then the composite indicator could provide a clearer picture of the business cycle. A composite leading indicator provides a forecast of where the cycle is heading. A composite coincident indicator provides a window on where the business cycle stands. And a composite index of lagging indicators provides a guide to the remaining stress in the economy. Take a moment to watch this discussion of the OECD leading indicator use.
Economists use a range of tools to understand short and medium-term trends in economic activity. One such tool developed at the OECD is the Composite Leading Indicators series. The CLIs are composed of economic indicators whose ups and downs are similar to those of the business cycle, but which anticipate turning points 6 to 9 months before they happen. Typical indicators in the CLI include orders and inventory changes, financial market indicators like share prices, business confidence surveys, and, in smaller open economies, data on key sectors and trends in key trading partners. CLIs are calculated monthly for 33 OECD countries, a number of major non-OECD economies, and several regional aggregates. They're usually represented in graphic form, starting with the business cycle, which measures fluctuations in economic activity. Between a peak and a trough, the downward slope indicates growth below normal. Similarly, between a trough and a peak, the upward slope indicates growth that is faster than normal. When both the business cycle indicator and the CLI are increasing, This indicates steady growth above long-term trends. Later, the CLI forms a peak, indicating that economic growth will soon fall below its long-term potential. At that very moment, none of this is observable in the business cycle indicator, which is still rising. It's only 6 to 9 months later that the business cycle follows the path indicated earlier by the CLI, and indeed, economic growth falls short of its long-term potential. Downward trending CLIs mark slower than normal growth, and in more serious cases, a recession. Likewise, the CLI can provide an early indication that the first signs of recovery are arriving, several months before the recovery becomes apparent in the business cycle indicator.
Hopefully, this gave you a perspective on why grouping indicators by their cyclical timing, especially for those that lead the business cycle, could be useful for forecasting where the economy is headed. How do economic theories explain business cycles? We don't want to lose sight of theories that might help us to understand swings in the business cycle, and just focus on empirical relationships. About 75 years ago, the early work at the NBER was criticized as measurement without theory. NBER researchers would argue, however, that you could not develop a theory without having some empirical understanding. Although the debate has long faded from the economic discussion, there is some value in remembering it. Each macroeconomic theory emphasizes a primary dynamic and channel that causes the fluctuation in economic growth. The process of change may be considered the same in many theories, but the catalyst for change may be different. Some theories focus on the monetary channel, that is money growth, such as the Austrian school, and interest rates. Some theories highlight the demand channel, for example, Keynes' theory and others. Some theories view an imbalance as the cause of the business cycle that develops in the economy. There are lots of different versions of this variant, including the Wesley Mitchell view of a price-cost-profit imbalance, which is largely forgotten, but may offer a lot of insight on the cyclical process without emphasis on any particular theory. Theories that best explain empirical understanding help us to bridge the gap between theory and reality. Let's now explore Wesley Mitchell's barebones theory. What is the price-cost-profit imbalance cause of business cycles? Wesley Mitchell developed the price-cost-profit imbalance sequence in the business cycle dynamic, based on his reading of the empirical record. The idea is that a jump in prices or wages will raise the cost of goods and services, and reduce profit margins, and potentially profits. In turn, a reduction in profits will reduce business investment, which will dampen economic growth. This imbalance idea was the starting point for Mitchell's explanation of the business cycle. This simple theory links wage and price pressures to profit margins, and then to investment. How might an original institutionalist view today's business cycle dynamic? The economy has been impacted by a number of changes over the last few decades, including new non-bank sources of liquidity, that is, lending, new payment methods, such as cryptocurrency, different and faster ways of communicating, purchasing, and selling, through the internet, more opportunities for remote work. There have been some major shifts in the age of the workforce in some economies. Japan or the US, for example. There is seemingly a faster response to weakening economic conditions by fiscal and monetary policymakers, with increasingly reduced policy implications of the size of the fiscal deficit, and many other outside impacts on the macroeconomy. In many respects, the original institutionalist will question how each of those factors, and other social and political changes, might affect the price-cost-profit balance that Wesley Mitchell, who is considered an original institutionalist, highlighted as a key dynamic of the business cycle. A collective assessment of all these factors, therefore, will shape the expected impact on the business cycle. How do changing expectations cause business cycles? Swings in mass psychology can affect the economic motivation for investment and consumption. A lot of business cycle theories tend to include some psychological factor. Maybe not as the primary driver of the cycle, but as one of the supporting factors. Even Keynes had a key role for psychology in his theory of investment. How do shocks explain business cycles? The role of external shocks as a cause of the business cycle is largely a statistical argument, and offers less of an intuitive understanding of the full channels of influence. However, shocks to the economy are often thought of as the catalyst for a business cycle. How does easy money cause business cycles? The Austrian theory of the business cycle argues that an artificial credit-induced expansion, driven by unwarranted money supply growth, reduces the market rate of interest below its natural rate, which is the concept of R*, which we will discuss in more depth later, which, in turn, stimulates excessive credit-financed investment. Then when the market rate of interest increases due to the boom, these credit-financed investments cease, and the economy falls into recession. How does risk create fluctuation in the business cycle? Errors of judgment play a key role in economic instability. Those errors could either accentuate a boom or an economic downturn. Okay, so far, we have touched upon different factors and theories that give rise to business cycle swings. But a more encompassing question was raised by Burns and Mitchell. What is the concept of the cycle of cycles? The cycle of business cycles hypothesis by Burns and Mitchell argues that the economic dynamic has two parts: an industrial phase and a speculative phase. These business cycle scholars wrote, after a severe depression, industrial activity rebounds sharply, but speculation does not. The following contraction in business is mild, which leads people to be less cautious. So, in the next 2 or 3 cycles, while the cyclical advances become progressively smaller in industrial activity, they become progressively larger in speculative activity. Finally, the speculative boom collapses, and a drastic liquidation follows, which ends this cycle of cycles, and brings us back to the starting point. When Arthur Burns was chair of the Federal Reserve Board, he used this idea in a speech to provide perspective on the economy for the 1960s and early 1970s. Little research has been done on whether this idea could explain recent business cycles, but it does link some psychology, speculative behavior, and the severity of business cycles as a multi-cycle process. With the 2008 global financial crisis, economies experienced shortages in liquidity, or what might be called a credit crunch. What is meant by the term credit crunch? The term credit crunch was first applied in 1966 to what has been described as the first financial crisis of the post-World War II period in the United States. It describes an economic situation where liquidity in the economy is too limited, which triggers a recession. In recent years, the Federal Reserve and other central banks are keenly aware of the potential for credit crunches, but now have a new tool of quantitative easing to aggressively counter the situation by injecting massive amounts of liquidity into the economy, if needed. Another term that has popped up recently in the financial press is the worry about stagflation. What is meant by the term stagflation in economics? The term stagflation was coined by a British member of the UK House of Commons, who argued in the mid-1960s that the British economy was experiencing both stagnation and inflation. From an economist standpoint, Professor Martin Bronfenbrenner defined stagflation as a condition in which the price level is rising despite the existence of substantial unemployment. He also called it unemployment inflation. We have not experienced this condition in the United States since the 1980 bout of high inflation and a high unemployment rate, when the annual unemployment rate in 1980 averaged 7.1%, along with a 13.5% average inflation rate in that year. However, from time to time there is a concern that a similar situation could return. Is there a quantitative rule for determining stagflation periods? No. There is no hard and fast quantitative rule when stagflation periods exist. Generally, periods in the 1970s, such as 1973-74 and 1978-80, are considered examples of when U.S. stagflation existed. Why is long-term economic growth important? Business cycle recessions interrupt the long-term trend growth in the economy. But fundamentally, why is long-term economic growth important? Economic growth is the main driver of higher living standards and economic development, which is reason enough for policymakers to strive for economic growth strong enough, but not too strong to trigger rising inflation. Moreover, long-term economic growth that is sustained and inclusive is central to the World Bank's twin goals for nations. Those World Bank goals are 1. Ending extreme poverty, and 2. Boosting shared prosperity among countries. Is the long-term trend of the economy influenced by the short-term fluctuations in the economy? Indeed, the short-term and long-term are intertwined. Short-term fluctuations can affect the long-term trend, especially if an economic shock is permanent. Although question number 196 is advanced material, and not required, if you are interested in the concern about short-term impacts on long-term growth, read that answer on what is meant by the term hysteresis. In a nutshell, a recession can have permanent effects on the economy, with a non-fully reversible adjustment, or correction path back to the trend that existed prior to the recession. The 2008 recession is considered one such episode of this hysteresis. Is there an economic nirvana? Well, that question leads us to what the steady-state economy is. A steady state in the economy occurs when the gap vanishes between actual and its goals in key variables of unemployment, inflation, growth, and interest rates, and that steady-state economic environment is sustained. Take a moment and understand the steady-state economy's conditions for jobs, inflation, economic growth, and interest rates. Although it is unlikely to exist, or if it did it might be short-lived, but it does represent a full set of economic goals being achieved. Is actual long-term economic growth equal to long-term potential output? Not necessarily. Over the long haul, real potential output provides an estimate of non-inflationary long-term economic growth, while actual real GDP growth makes no claim that long-term economic growth is without inflationary pressure or economic fluctuation. What is the trend in U.S. economic growth? The trend to an economist depends on the time horizon. It depends on whether it is extrapolated from the past, or projected based on changing factors in the economy, such as real potential GDP. What determines long-term economic growth? In the last few questions, we focused on the statistical concept of trend, but this question goes to the heart of the theoretical underpinning for economic growth, which is largely a result of advancing technology, as the main contributor to economic growth. To be sure, other factors enter into the discussion also, such as demographics, but most studies suggest that technology is the key to long-term growth. How does economic development differ from economic growth? For the most part, economic development and economic growth get blurred together. However, academics tend to think of these concepts separately. The term economic development refers to long-term changes in systems of production and distribution of goods and services affecting human welfare. In contrast to economic growth involves changes in the form, as well as, the scale of economic activity. So, economic development focuses on the process of growth, while economic growth focuses on its scale. This concludes our discussion of cycles and trends in the economy. Take a moment to consider the questions on this slide before moving ahead.